badges? Beatle badges? I don't need to show you no Beatle badges. Hey everybody, welcome to The Bottom Line. I'm Michael Noland, and tonight we're going to do something just a bit different. So I don't know about you, but nothing gets me more into the mood for Christmas than a fresh Beatles release. From the time I was 9 until this very day, the Beatles have been known as a band that puts out hot summer releases, remember 1967, as well as albums just in time for the silly season. Well, thanks to Disney and Apple, originally Michael Hogg and now Peter Jackson, we have a wonderful documented bit of history available for us for the very first time. Now, every Beatle fan has their own personal story of how they discovered the Beatles, what the Beatles meant to them, and everything else, right? They'll regale you with the first time they heard a particular song, or the first time that someone turned them on, sometimes in more ways than one, to a brand new Beatle album. Now, I put together a bit of a collage of what exactly the album Let It Be, which was originally going to be Get Back. Now, historically, the whole project has been a bit of a black eye for the Beatles. Not for me, because I never saw the film in the light that the critics took delight, thank you, Jan Werner, as a film that presented the Beatles' cold winter in hell. Now, thanks to Michael Lindsay Hogg's eagle eye and his original way of trying to capture what was going on at Twickenham Studios, thanks to the original footage shot and hidden microphones, and thanks to now Peter Jackson, one of the greatest directors in Hollywood history, we now have a finished product and perhaps a bit more fair view of the whole project. Now, unfortunately, many people think that the Let It Be album is the Beatles at their very nadir of existing. Even in its original two-sided release, you had Long Winding Road, Let It Be, Get Back, and Across the Universe. 4 major hits on one double-sided LP. Not to mention the classics such as One After 909, one of John Lennon's very best songs, a song he wrote when he was 15, by the way, as well as a wonderful guitar-based ballad by Paul and another guitar-based ballad written pretty much 50-50 by him and John right there on the spot. And let me say this about George Harrison. Without George Harrison, and not just as a guitarist, or as a backing vocalist, or a guest vocalist, without every single one of George Harrison's songs recorded as a Beatles song, the Beatles would have never been the Beatles. And to you naysayers, I even include Don't Bother Me. George himself didn't like the song. Years later, he said it was barely a song. I disagree with him, and when you compare that song to all of the Lennon and McCartney songs on that album that aren't #1 hits, it holds up very strongly. So obviously, big George Harrison fan. But enough for now on the individual Beatles. We'll cover that with what Peter Jackson and Michael Lindsay Hogg has presented us. But we'll get back to individual Beatles in a moment. Now, unfortunately, thanks to a lot of powerful publications like Rolling Stone, I'm talking to you, Jan, the critics of the time totally manipulated the narrative of these sessions. To many people, this is exactly what happened. The Beatles recorded Abbey Road. Then the Beatles went into really shabby recording sessions, and their worst album ever was released. This led to Paul fooling around with an inconsequential little piece of tripe, according to Rolling Stone, releasing an album that John Lennon then took exception to, and he released one of his albums that the critics adored with him holding a pig, just like Paul was holding a ram on his Ram album. So for many, that's the narrative. The Beatles made all these wonderful albums, culminating in the magnificent Abbey Road and its second side, opera-like existence, to finally just folding as four weakened individuals and presenting a trash album. But this is not what we see in Peter Jackson's film. We don't see this narrative, do we? First of all, let's historically correct that sequence of events, shall we? All right? First of all, the Beatles got together and recorded at Twickenham Studios in order to film themselves prior to a special televised live event showcasing them together for the first time really as a live performing rock band. Now, no one's arguing with the fact that recording at Twickenham and rehearsing at Twickenham must have been some of the most miserable conditions to get ready for such a major project. But they didn't stop there. And as this film clearly shows them practicing songs that would wind up on Abbey Road. Now, the final release of Let It Be was never intended to be a major movie for the Beatles to present to their casual fans. Most casual fans are very aware of Hard Day's Night, Help, and even Yellow Submarine. But there are two films that casual fans have eschewed from. The first one being Magical Mystery Tour, partially due to it being released in black and white, and then the second film your casual fan may not be that aware of is Let It Be. It certainly hasn't helped that it hasn't been available, except for bootleg versions. For decades, and us Beatle fans have always been on the search for the very best bootleg quality that we could find. I was 15 when this film came out, and I went to see it almost every single day, sometimes multiple screenings, for its entire 2-week run. Now, one thing I can tell you, the theater was never packed. Now, where their earlier films would have fans wrapped around the theater waiting for the next showing, when I went to see this film, the theater was mostly empty. But that didn't deter me. I was a young singer-songwriter, and the little bit that I knew at 15 had been taught to me by these four young men. So I think it's important to keep in mind when we watch this film where it stands in the sequence of events. Don't forget, the Beatles would go on to record what many people think is their very best album, Abbey Road, shortly after these sessions. So let's take a look at how Peter Jackson not so much covers that black eye with makeup, but cures it with a big stake to the eye. Because with discernment, this 3-part series is an eye-opener. You have them going over songs like Teddy Boy from the McCartney album, as well as Backseat of My Car from Ram. Now, I'm a major Beatle fan. I am very aware of their history, and I seem to have a memory just to memorize this stuff, right? Until I saw this series, I never knew that Backseat of My Car was really a Beatles song. You say, well, no, the Beatles didn't record it, so therefore it wasn't a Beatles song. And yet we have them recorded, performing it. It's a Beatles song. Give Me Some Truth from John Lennon's Imagine album. Paul even suggesting what to do with the song. Working on it earnestly, knowing it could be the next Lennon track that he and John would record together with George and Ringo. You have George showcasing the magnificent All Things Must Pass. Historically, your casual Beatle fan has been told that the Beatles just showed no interest in All Things Must Pass. Totally untrue. These recordings clearly bring out all four Beatles working on George's songs. If anyone in the Beatles was responsible for George's All Things Must Pass not being on the album, it was George. George at one point even said, I don't think I want any of my songs on this project. But that's George. That's how George dealt with his two big brothers in the Beatles. It also covers the famous fight between Paul and George. Now, in the original Let It Be version, Paul and George get into it, and shortly thereafter, George says, I'm off to the clubs, bye, I'm out of here. And the next thing you see is 5 minutes of Yoko Ono. Thank God there's not a lot of Yoko here. And you know what? I don't think there was a lot of Yoko there, other than what we see there. You can cut film to make it look like somebody is just the worst person in the world, and I think it was purposefully done. And John and Yoko didn't argue too much at the time. In this version, Yoko's there. Of course she was. She was there all the time. Was it uncomfortable for Paul and Ringo and George? Of course it was. There was no room for anyone else in the studio, including girlfriends, wives, buddies, and pals. Only a couple of musicians ever breached those walls. Brian Jones, a couple of the Stones, Eric Clapton, and of course, as Get Back clearly shows, Billy Preston. Now, I don't know if you recall, in the original Let It Be film, the very first opening scene, you see Mal Evans, their road manager, carrying the painted sign for Ringo's drum kit. The next thing we see is Paul and Ringo playing on the piano, goofing around. Then George and John dribble in with their most dour faces. So what did the editing in that film present? It showed Paul and good old Ringo showing up right on spot, and the two other Beatles who have problems with Paul taking over, showing up late, resentful. And yet we now find that it was actually John and George, closely followed by Ringo, and finally Paul. You see, the original opening was filmed from day 2. Day 1, John was there, he was alert, he was going through possible songs with the other two until Paul finally showed up. Now, the next part of both films, for me, are wonderful sections. Now, in the original mix, you get this incredible amount of time with the Beatles just diddling and doodling and not really gluing together. And then they have this small section at the end of the Twickenham studio recordings where they're starting to get tight. And then they go to their new facilities at Apple and really get tight, and that's where Billy Preston shows up, and by the time they get to the rooftop, they're hot. In Peter Jackson's version, though, he didn't get rid of any of that, but there's also a whole lot more of them really working on their songs. Here you hear McCartney singing vocal parts that you go, wow, that would have been great in this song. Remember the anthology when they started doing different versions that didn't make their albums? You've got Dick James dropping in and trying to encourage the Beatles to get into the music publishing. You know, it's interesting here. They all politely listened to Dick. After all, John had a big stake in how well Dick ran the Lennon and McCartney catalog. He knew that was important. But here we see the genesis of a billionaire in the making, before Dick James leaves. And by the way, Dick James wasn't just a music publisher. Before getting into music publishing, he was a crooner. He was a famous crooner. One of the earliest television shows that I was a major fan of growing up was Robin Hood, and it had this opening. The crooner who sung that every week was Dick James. So this man came up through Hard Knocks as well. But here's where Paul and him divide themselves from the group, and Paul is even caught saying, you know, I don't think that song is that expensive. He got it. It starts off with Dick apologizing, saying, I know this seems like a lot to ask for this song or this group of songs. And Paul just instinctually knows that it's not that much to ask for. And then you have the constant hammering by Michael Lindsay Hogg, who just cannot get it through his head that the Beatles are not going to perform in an abandoned Roman centurion kind of palatial place. Now, we talked about how Paul always talked about the Beatles being a box. Here's the thing. They knew Paul was the showman. Michael Lindsay Hogg knew that if he was going to get this idea across, it was Paul that he really needed to sell it on. I love in this film how Paul just shuts him down immediately and says, no, that can't happen. Michael Lindsay Hogg goes, I don't understand why not. He said, well, Ringo says no. Ringo had as much power as any other Beatle. This is one of the key magic bits about the Beatles that make them stand out beyond any other rock band in history. This is why their music will survive 2, 3, 4, 500 years into the future. Our great-great-great-great-grandchildren will learn about them in college, right along with Beethoven, right along with Mozart, and even Vivaldi. Vivaldi. In the original film, we see John Lennon and Yoko Ono dancing around while George, Paul, and Ringo play George's new song, I Me Mine. Articles at the time explained this moment in the studio as John just ignoring George like he always did. But with the new footage, we see, no, John's really interested. As a matter of fact, he's playing on one of George's songs. He's giving input, okay? But this was never released in the original version. And that's another thing. Note how much more footage there is of John Lennon being much more involved than the original version showed. Was this John Lennon at his greatest moment in time? No. Soon to be an outright heroin addict and yet still able to display his clear genius. There are a few shots of him looking like he's more asleep than awake, and we all know that's because of too much tea. And yes, there's a lot of Paul taking up the slack, but this whole project, like Sgt. Pepper, like Magical Mystery Tour, was one of Paul's projects. He's the one who proposed, let's just get back to the basics. That's what we're doing in the studio anyway. Before we were at least traveling new sonic grounds, you say you want to get back to the real rock roots. Well, then let's really do it. He wanted the Beatles just to show up in small little clubs unannounced. Of course, they weren't going to have any of that, and for him to get them up on the rooftop eventually, even though he's cleverly concealing that's exactly where he wants to show up at. Some of his very first thoughts on the whole project was, let's show up somewhere where we can get arrested. Years later, Paul would do exactly what he wanted the Beatles to originally do with the Get Back sessions. He formed his own band Wings, and he packed himself, the kids, the dog, and band members with girlfriends, packed them all up, and just showed up unannounced at universities throughout that portion of England. Exactly what he wanted the Beatles to do. But even in the case of the argument with George, take a look at how that resolves. Now, when they abandoned recording at Twickenham, this is where they go to their newly built recording facilities at Apple. George is back, everything's fine. The film kind of indicates that Billy Preston just showed up one day. Hey, we used to tour, what's going on, fellas? But the story behind the line is George once again grabbing a musician from outside to whip the Beatles into shape because he knew they weren't gelling. He had done this earlier with Eric Clapton on the song While My Guitar Gently Weeps. He didn't feel the Beatles were giving it their all. But you know, even the early recordings, that smoky piano by Paul McCartney, bass line, I think the Beatles were giving it their all. George just needed 110%. Any Beatle at any given time could be quite the prima donna. And though George may have been a little brother, he was never the type of guy to let John and Paul push him around. So here we are in brand new recording facilities. They're all excited to be there. A good friend from the old days is there and helping him out musically. This frees Paul to be on bass guitar live while Billy Preston handles the keyboards. These are some of the very best recordings. This is where your casual fan will start picking up interest. Now, in this longer version, this section of the film doesn't hold up quite as well as I believe the original version showed. And the reason for this is he stays on this subject too long, and the very best sections of this part of the film had already been included in the original version. But once again, there is so much wonderful footage here, and especially if you're a musician. And by the way, did anybody catch the Nirvana lick? Kurt, are the Beatles responsible for inventing grunge? This brings us to the third part of the series where the Beatles finally wind up on the rooftop of Apple Studios and play for London proper in the middle of winter with coats borrowed from their wives, the very last performance by the Beatles. But the editing between the performances on the roof, the police arriving, and the casual passerby noticing the Beatles playing just from the streets was much more masterfully handled by Michael Lindsay Hogg. So in the end, as a Beatle fan, I'll give this 5 out of 4 stars for sure. But is it for every Beatle fan? Probably not. I think you'll get a lot of people. It's on Disney Plus, so they'll be sure to get their money's worth and at least watch a portion of it. I think it's going to be on in a lot of families' living room with one, maybe 2 members watching it and the others watching bits and pieces. And that's fine. That's what Peter Jackson has created here. Is it too long? Probably. Now, what I would suggest they do is to edit one good 3-hour version of this film. Modern audiences are all up to snuff for staying for 3 hours if the film is good. Avengers Endgame, anyone? A 3-hour film of them working with just the right footage could go over quite well. Either way, like I said, it's not quite Christmas without a Beatle release, so thank you, Santa, and quit kissing mommy. So that's a quick wrap on my thoughts on the new Get Back series on Disney Plus. Now, I know this was a bit of a departure for what we usually cover here, and being a film critic is not our main focus here at all. So the intention is, when we do these forays, we're going to shoot for Friday night release. We'll keep our tutorials on a Sunday through Thursday basis, as well as our product shootouts, and of course we'll release road trips as they happen. But an occasional foray is sometimes kind of nice. The tribal elders are gathering. So if you enjoyed the video tonight, give us a thumbs up, and please consider subscribing to the channel. Just hit subscribe to the tribe and hit that top bell notification, and you'll be notified of all future videos to come your way.